welcome everyone to our last event in the Bay Area Latin American Forum Series of the Center for Latin American Studies. My name is Mariana Insua, and I'm the program coordinator at the center. We're very pleased today to have Mathias Craig with us today. He's a UC Berkeley alum and also the co-founder and executive director of blueEnergy. So please join me in welcoming Mathias Craig.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on campus always. I live right down the street, so you might see me around sometimes. What I want to talk to you about today is the issue of energy and water access, and about the work that I've been doing in Nicaragua in that topic, and also about the interrelationships between energy, water, and a few other things I think that are worth thinking about, the interconnections. Before I start about the organization and the work that we're doing, though, I think it's important to go back and talk a little bit about what motivated me to do this work and how I got into it. That's a picture of my mother. I don't know if you can guess which one. To working in Nicaragua in the 1980s as a linguist. She's done a lot of lecturing here on campus, actually, at Berkeley, but she was at the University of Oregon, head of the linguistics department there, and is a specialist in indigenous languages of the Americas. And so from when I was very young, 6 months old, started traveling to Mexico and Guatemala and Nicaragua and various other countries in the Western Hemisphere. So that's a deep route for me before I got into all the engineering and the technical work. This is a picture of me in Nicaragua in 1989, just to sort of set the context here. And I think for me, it was really a time where I learned to appreciate what I had in the United States, and it really made me think about the basics. What happens when you're living in conditions where you don't have access to basic services, the impact that has on your life. This was during the Civil War. This was at the tail end of it, but you still had the US embargo. They had just been hit by a hurricane a little bit further north in this picture, but a big devastating hurricane in the region. So it was a very, very challenging context, and it made me think a lot about things like energy and water and basic services. I grew up in Oregon. As I mentioned, my mother was a professor there. That also got me interested in thinking about ecology, about the environment. I went to a boarding school down near Santa Barbara for my last 2 years of school. It was all about self-reliance, again, teaching you about the connection to the land, so again, reinforcing those thoughts and values that I had. Then I was at Berkeley from 1996 to 2001. I was in the civil and environmental engineering department, but I wanted to be an ERGI, but they didn't have an undergraduate degree at the time for an ERGI, the Energy and Resource Group here on the third floor. So I spent a lot of time in this building, and this is actually where I got my interest in renewable energy. I was studying a lot of water issues in civil engineering, but I learned about energy right here in this building. I went to MIT for graduate school, and that's where blueEnergy got its start. So I took a class. I was again in civil and environmental engineering, but I took a class called Entrepreneurship in the Developing World, sort of stumbled upon it. And that's where I connected my interests in energy and water and Nicaragua. So wanting to go back there and have an impact in that area. So we launched in Nicaragua in 2004, shortly after I got out of school. So a little bit about blueEnergy. blueEnergy's mission is to work for a more equitable, sustainable world. It's a very broad mission, but it's very meaningful to us. And it essentially has two parts to it. The first part is helping the most isolated poor get access to clean energy and clean water. And the second part is using our deep experience in community development as an immersive learning platform for students to get involved. So I've worked with several ERG students here on campus. We've worked with a lot of engineering students to get them involved so that they can get the real-life experience that complements the classroom education they're getting. If they're interested in energy, water, or international development, get out in the field, see what it's really like, and use that experience to help launch careers in this field. That's our approach. So why did we start with water and energy? Why are those so important? I think many of you may know, you know how critical water is in your life, but it is the largest killer of people, more than all violence, all forms of violence combined around the world. It's the second leading cause of death for children under the age of 5, basically diarrhea-related death. And so water is it's one that people understand pretty intrinsically about why you might start with that if you're trying to build a foundation for sustainable development. Energy is perhaps not quite as directly clear. I think it's easy to take for granted the role that energy plays in our lives because most of the time we don't see it. It's sort of behind the walls. You flick the switch, the light comes on, and you don't really think about it unless the light doesn't come on. Then you're very upset during those times. But you know, there's electricity in our lives, the energy we use to heat water, for example, to take showers. It's ubiquitous. But this is the only graph that I will show you. Don't worry. But there's sort of two trends here I think that are important to observe. One is that as you go from left to right, and the bottom axis is electricity consumption, how much electricity people are consuming sort of per capita per year. And the two trends are from left to right, it goes up. On the y-axis, you have the Human Development Index. Are people familiar with that? It's a measure from the United Nations. You could think of it as it's a proxy measure for well-being. Measures things like infant mortality, life expectancy, income per capita, the various metrics, and it gets boiled down into a 0 to 1 scale. But you can think of it as a proxy measure for well-being or quality of life. So what you see is it goes up as you go to the right, so you consume more electricity, of a higher rate of well-being. But the other important thing is the shape. It doesn't go up linearly. It curves very sharply like this. So the implication is that when you go from no energy to a little bit of energy, your quality of life can increase dramatically, right? As you get more and more industrialized, and it has less of an impact. You know, if you're getting your fourth car, it doesn't have that much impact on your life versus your first car. So that's an important shape. So we are really focusing on this area. How do you get a basic amount of electricity to people? And the kind of communities that we are interested in serving are the isolated poor. So we make a distinction between just being poor and isolated poor. So there's a lot of communities around the world, urban areas, peri-urban areas, where there's extreme poverty and people living on $1 or $2 a day. And there's been a lot of innovation in that space in the last 10 years with the advent of microfinance and social enterprises. And a lot of our associates work in that space and have done a lot of great work. But there is this gap. If you go a little bit further out and you go to places where maybe there isn't microfinance yet and there aren't roads and maybe they don't have cell phones yet. I mean, the story you hear is that everybody has a cell phone now around the world, right? And that's very true in certain parts of the world, but it's also not true in other parts of the world. So our interest is in working with communities that suffer multiple barriers to development and thinking about how do you work across sectors, how do you put together a suite of solutions that can help change lives in that context. And it's very different than just going in and delivering solar lanterns, for example, and just selling solar lanterns. You can create a nice social business with that. This is much broader based. Now, we feel it's important to address, I don't want to say market, but to address this target population for two reasons. One is sort of a pure social justice standpoint, that if you believe that everybody has the right to have basic opportunities to pursue in their life, energy and water are fundamental to those. They're fundamental to education, to health, to economic development, to everything. So we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to have access to those services. But secondly, and perhaps some people resonate with that and some people don't. Some people say, well, if they're too hard to serve, you know, that's too bad. But we don't take that approach. Now, there's a second piece of it, though, that resonates, I think, with a broader audience. And it's important to recognize that these services and these fields they don't exist in isolation, right? There's strong interconnections between energy and water. And I'll throw up a third one, land, which, yeah, it's some nice background music. You throw in land, which isn't an area that we work in. Land, i.e. food productivity, for example, or forestry. It's not an area that we work in directly, but we work closely with partners in that area. But there's very strong interconnections between energy, water, and land. And one of the issues is that if you go to the most isolated, poor places in the world, there's a strong correlation between sort of that economic condition and where indigenous people are, for example. And this is just one connection I'll mention here. There's a strong correlation there. There's also a very strong correlation between where indigenous people are and where the forest still stands. So when you look at it from an ecological standpoint for all of us everywhere in the world, there's obviously a strong correlation between land use and climate change being a global issue. So again, a lot of the most sensitive and vital ecosystems that are still intact in the world are in areas where there are indigenous people. They're looking to improve their quality of life. It's vital to everyone's interest that they don't follow the path that we followed exactly, but you also can't deny them the right to better health, better education, better economic development if that's what they choose. So we take a very long-term view that we're also defining a different development path for those people and doing it with them. So that's one that I think interests everybody, the nexus here. And take one example of the nexus of energy, land, water, for example, would be under climate change, rain patterns are becoming increasingly variable, right? And we're already seeing that tremendously in Nicaragua. Again, we work with a lot of farmers, and they're always talking about that. They've always depended on natural rainfall. So part of the adaptation solution might be, okay, we might need to look at implementing energy solutions, solar power, for example, to pump water, to irrigate land, to increase yields, right? And they all link together very closely. So we have chosen to focus our efforts in Nicaragua on the Caribbean coast. It's a region, I don't know, has anybody here been to Nicaragua? All right. You've been to Bluefields, all right, great. So you can call me out if I'm lying. It's a very divided country, just historically, between the Pacific and the Caribbean side of the country. Very different development paths. I'll leave it at that. Happy to talk more about that later if people want to learn more. But the Caribbean side of Nicaragua was colonized by the British, not the Spanish. And it set a very different trajectory. You have a highly multi-ethnic population on the Caribbean coast with at least 4 large indigenous groups and many other smaller groups. Different Afro-descendant groups. You have the Creole, you have the Garifuna, and then you have the Mestizos, which is sort of what they call the Spaniards on the coast, which is the predominant population from the Pacific. They also have a large presence on the Caribbean. But it is very much defined by isolation. As of right now, there's not a road, for example, that goes all the way over to Bluefields. And Bluefields is the largest city on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. So you have to fly in there or come in by boat. So that's a symbol of the isolation. And there's basically a general lack of all civil infrastructure. Bluefields has some roads and an electric grid, but you go outside that one town, there's really very little infrastructure. And that characterizes the area. Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. And this region is by far the poorest within Nicaragua. So it's a combination of sort of the family history that took me there originally multiple times when I was younger, but then also when we started thinking about what kind of communities do we want to work with, this was it. We wanted to take on the tough challenge and commit to that place and figure out how to make it work. So the red dots are communities that we're working in or have worked in. So our 2 major programs on the ground, again, are energy and water. We have different water solutions and different energy solutions. When the organization started, we explored wind power, but we've transitioned most of our electricity generation to solar now. This picture is an example of, this is a high-rise out in one of the communities we're working in. And it is by far the most sophisticated building. It's the community center in an indigenous Rama community. 2 stories. You have a little pulperia, a little store that an entrepreneur in the community has started downstairs, so they're selling things. The upstairs serves as a hotel for when government officials or the medical brigades come into town, for example. And then they also have a meeting room down. So a highly functional, multi-use sort of community center. And we did the electricity system. So it's kind of dark in here, but you see the solar panels and lighting it. So this is one example of the kind of projects we do, working with community entities, either community centers, it could be a church, it could be a clinic, and doing installations with institutions. We also do individual solar home installations. This is a community of Rocky Point, just north of Bluefields. It's a very poor farming community. So in this case, the system is privately owned by the individual family. This was part of a project we did in the community of Monkey Point, south of Bluefields, working with a medical center, which is it's a very modest medical center, a room maybe half the size of this room, and working with Carla, she's the nurse there. And she had been petitioning for years the government to have medicine stored in Monkey Point. It's a 4 to 6 hour boat ride to the nearest town if you have an outboard motor. It can be days of paddling. And she's experienced a lot of deaths of children from snake bites, et cetera, from just not being able to store basic medicines at the clinic. So we partnered with the Ministry of Health. We designed the energy system, they put in the freezer, and Carla runs the center. So it's a good example of sort of the collaboration we have with various government entities. Now, looking at water, we call it a WASH program. It's a water and sanitation and hygiene integrated program. And we want to look at the issue of how do you prevent water contamination in the first place? How do you help people get access to water? And then how do you make sure that that water they get access to is clean? We're looking at all three parts. So the picture here is a well drilling operation. We've been working now for 2 years with a manual well drilling technique that was developed in Bolivia by some Baptist missionaries. It's a very low capital cost, very labor intensive, but very low capital cost method of drilling. You get down to about 80 or 100 feet. Get access to clean water, and it has a concrete cap at the top to prevent contamination. Second part is the purification. So this is a Biosand water filter that we manufacture in Nicaragua, in Bluefields. And we partnered with an organization in Canada called COST. I think it's about 3 years ago now. They're championing this technology around the world. So they had the manuals, and they sent technicians down, trained us in the manufacturing of it. And then we have a nice partnership in terms of sharing training materials. So when people go through training, they provide the basic materials, and they iterate on it every year. And when we have suggestions, we feed it back to them. So this is a very good example, I think, of the kinds of technology partnerships that we have and that we're always looking to build, where our strength is adapting the technology locally, sort of tweaking the technology rather than designing things from scratch and taking them through the very rocky design process. We like to look at technologies that are proven to have champions around the world but need adaptation. Right? Almost no technology just works when you send it out into the field in a completely different climate, different social conditions, different economics. So we helped improve the way these were manufactured, for example. We automated part of the sand sifting process. That was an innovation for them as well. So it's a good two-way collaboration. And third part is latrines, which we've been exploring in the last year. And this year, we're putting in our first latrines in Bluefields. We've been studying technologies being used in Honduras and Guatemala. Again, not reinventing the wheel, but looking at what kind of adaptation it's going to require for the local context. So looking at the energy-water nexus, so sort of the interconnection between energy and water. The examples I just showed you previously, they're sort of standalone. The Biosand water filter purifies water, doesn't have an energy input. It's just helping people get clean water. But if you zoom out to take a look at the bigger picture, a lot of the opportunities around economic development in the area or improving food security, it's going to require an intersection of multiple of these sectors, as I mentioned earlier. So this is a good example of a project we did just about 2 months ago. And it's an integrated energy, water, land system where we're using a solar power system that we installed. This is a farming cooperative building where they are starting to grow more interesting crops, and they're looking at doing some processing of the food to be able to get it to market, to preserve it, to dry it, to do a variety of things. So we partnered with them, and we designed and installed the energy system, and then we also installed the water system. So it's a solar-powered water pump, pumps it up to the tower. We designed a modified version of our Biosand filter, and actually that's up in here. So it stores the water in holding tanks at the top with the solar pump, filters it in the Biosand filter, and then puts it down to a holding tank where it then goes into this processing center. You could easily imagine this being expanded into helping irrigation. This could be connected to a drip irrigation system to help them bring a third crop during the dry season as well. So those are ongoing opportunities that the project can explore. This is a picture of the island of Ramaki, just south of Bluefields. This is an island I'd visited many times as a kid. And my mother had told me always very emphatically, never eat food or water. They'll always try to offer it to you when you're on the island, but never eat it. And I think, you never eat it or drink it. And I think this picture is striking to me because it's both, on one hand, it's very beautiful, right? It's this tropical thing. But if you zoom in and look carefully at what these are, right? Yeah, they're not even open pit latrines, they're just bottomless latrines, right? So there's no sanitation or sewage system in Ramaki or in Bluefields, really. It's all, which leads to an extremely high level of contamination of wells. Very often the most common arrangement is an open pit latrine and an open pit well, within feet of each other. So a very bad situation. So that's why my mother had said, don't ever drink anything on the island. Well, here I am, back on the island in January of this year. We had just finished an integrated energy and water system on the island. Again, solar panels to pump water, same systems, to holding tank, biosand filtration, another holding tank. And this is distributing to a clinic that's right next door and a school. So of course, as soon as I walked in, they're like, "You want to try it?" So I had to try it. I will admit I was a little bit nervous. I was hoping that we didn't miss any parts in the installation. But pleased to announce I didn't get sick. Now this is something, it's a drawing, there's no picture of it because it hasn't been done yet. But I think this is one of our most exciting future projects, which is very much at the center of the energy, water, and land nexus all together. This is a Agroforestry Center called Wawashan, north of Bluefields. It's run by a partner of ours called Fadkanik. They work in agroforestry and education. They have over 200 students that participate in this school. It's a boarding school. They come from 1,500 different farming communities over the years in the area. And they learn about better farming practices. They have a seed repository. They're looking for hurricane-resistant coconuts, for example. So they're doing research, seed banking, and training of young farmers who then go back to their farms and improve their yields in an environmentally friendly way. They've had a few ad hoc solar systems installed on the campus. There's 20 buildings. And they have a diesel generator, a hugely oversized diesel generator, which I was talking to the director of the center. He was estimating they spend about $35,000 a year on diesel fuel. Now, one thing about diesel generators is that if you run them at partial load, so if you have a 40 kilowatt diesel generator that you run at 5 kilowatts, because that's all the power you need at that point, it's very inefficient. So there's not only the issue of the cost of the fuel, but there's the issue that you're guaranteeing sort of inefficiency by, when you need to turn on a few light bulbs, you flick on your huge generator and burn a ton of fuel to light up a few things. So we're designing a mini grid, and this is in the early stages, but designing a mini grid for the center that would combine new high-tech solar power in the mini grid with a steam engine that's burning agricultural residue from the farm that the center has. So it's a nice mixture of new and old technology. So this is one that I think is a good example of the partnerships we have here with Berkeley. We're working with Dan Kamen here in the Energy and Resource Group and some of the students to get them involved. This could be, you know, PhD research for students. So our approach in the field just has a couple key highlights I want to make. One is the community engagement piece. We're very much not just a technology provider. We don't just go out, put technology out there, nor do we go out and do a half-day survey and ask people what they want and then just give them that. It's a much more deep relationship with the communities. We take our time in picking the communities that we're going to work with, and we spend a lot of time with them. We go back with them. We help them think about their development plans overall. And I think that relationship is absolutely critical to understand what technology might work and what implementation models might work in that community. You come with a solution, you want it to work a certain way, but they're coming from an entirely different place with different needs and different cultural context. It's important to spend the time to learn that to enable success. 2 is capacity building. Because the area is so poor in economic terms, the education system is very, very basic, and in a lot of communities non-existent. So the skill level, you're talking about the land, energy, water, Nexus, and designing mini-grids and these kinds of projects, the skill level required for that level of complexity to design these systems, to engage with the communities, and to think about long-term development strategy is significantly more than what the basic level of education that's being provided locally. So we work with local education institutions to provide supplemental training on top of the basics that they're learning in school. And that's a big commitment of ours, because in the long run, we want that to be more and more run by teams of locals. Valuing services. That's another cornerstone of our philosophy, that we don't give anything away. So we are structured as a nonprofit organization, and we never make profit on the direct services we provide, but we always have them contribute, both financially and in other ways. So, for example, the water filter, if a family is interested in getting a water filter, they go through 1 day of water and sanitation and hygiene training, and they contribute 1 day of labor in the shop to sift the sand that's going to go into their filter. Then they also pay about 8% of the capital cost. So we do a lot of, the community engagement team does a lot of the juggling work between understanding that we've chosen to work with the most isolated poor, so they don't have a lot of financial resources. That's why they didn't just go solve all these things themselves in the first place. Balancing that with the fact that you want to build buy-in over time, and you want to make sure that the solutions that you're providing are valued. And I know that seems, well, kind of simple or what, but all of us have a number of needs, right, in our life, and we prioritize them very differently. And you want to make sure you're not putting in a huge effort to help address their 27th priority need. So having things like some financial buy-in and in-kind services make sure that you're both on the same page, that this is a high priority thing. And finally, the long-term view. It's very difficult to just go in and create a solution that's going to last if you don't spend time to go in, try it, make adjustments, and be there for the follow-up. And again, part of that is working with the communities to think about their development plan. Okay, maybe this year we do solar lanterns because solar lighting is the #1 priority this year. But they also do some farming, and they're interested maybe in a solar irrigation system that might improve yields. So you can start to see the steps towards environmentally sustainable economic development. In terms of long-term view, this is a picture of me in one of the communities. There I am there, holding this little baby. 3 years ago, he came, and we supported him to come to Bluefields and go to high school. And now he's a full-time technician with blueEnergy. He actually just turned 23 years old, Gutri. But that's the kind of long-term commitment that we have there, right? It goes way beyond even just the 10 years that we've been there as an organization. This is a zoom in of the map I showed earlier on the Caribbean coast, showing the different communities that we're working in and the kinds of projects that we're doing. We've worked with about 10,000 people in 18 communities. I think that's the important takeaway. In terms of the challenges of working in these areas, again, no roads, right? So most of these communities come down here. We have to come out from the lagoon, come down along the ocean by boat. It's fiberglass boats on the ocean. And then sometimes, yeah, go up the river, which could be a whole nother challenge. To the south of Blue Fields is the Rama ethnic community. That's the group that my mother worked with and continues to work with 30 years later. So that's where I spent time as a kid. And then up north, you have Garifuna and Creole. And then up here, you start to have Mosquito Indians as you go there and further north. So it's a very multi-ethnic place. OK, I'm aware of the fact that I'm getting close on time. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Global Leadership Program. That's the immersive learning experience that we provide on the ground for students to get involved. We've had over 200 students participate in that program since we started it. One of our best partnerships is right here on campus with the Cal Energy Corps. We have 4 that are, it's a very competitive fellowship that undergraduates can apply for here on campus. I think they select 20 fellows overall every summer, and 4 of them are coming to blueEnergy this summer, but this is the 3rd year of our partnership. I just want to give you a couple quick examples of the kind of work that they've done. They are sometimes helping us pilot new technologies outside of our development programs to understand if they're technologies that we should include in our portfolio. This was a group of MIT students that were doing a study on coconut husk charcoal briquettes to offset mahogany briquettes that people use for cooking. This was another project with MIT students actually doing a pilot of a biogas reactor to feed a stove that a woman was running a small restaurant out of. A lot of our latrine testing over the last 2 years, piloting different technologies, has been with students in the Global Leadership Program. Some of you may know We Care Solar, an organization affiliated with Berkeley here. We've also piloted some of their suitcases down there as part of that program. And then so the students can make a choice if they want to work on piloting a new technology, which is often related to, say, a master's thesis or an undergraduate senior thesis requirement, or they can participate in our standing development programs. So in this case, students were working in designing and installing solar systems in homes in Rocky Point, where they get to go through the process and work with our development team and see all the steps. And there's Gutri again. So there's Gutri working with Sasha. She was learning about the Biosand water filtration technology. So finally, last thing, just where we are in the organization's growth. Concept to action, it was a class in 2002, sort of did a feasibility study in 2003, and we launched in 2004 in Nicaragua. In 2005, 2008, we were very focused on energy, and we were primarily working with wind power and some solar power. But through our assessments and the change in the economic climate and the cost of solar, we really made a pivot and decided to focus on solar in 2010-11. And in 2009, we introduced the water and sanitation program, as well as formalized the Global Leadership Program. So our focus right now is building the partnerships, adopting new technologies, continuing to bring those services to more people in Nicaragua, and building the Global Leadership Program. And the key part for that is building relationships with campuses. So if you have thoughts about how we can connect to different student groups or different departments here on campus to let them know about this opportunity, I would appreciate it. Yeah, and the future vision is really that the impact of the organization is going to be driven by the global leaders that come through our program. So we view our work in Nicaragua as an immersive learning experience. We're constantly learning how to do the work better on the ground, and we want to share that with students who are going to go work around the world on these issues. That's it.
Thank you, Mathias.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
So I'm wondering, when you decide to go into a new community within Blue Fields, you obviously have a long-standing reputation that you can bring with you, but how do you identify who to engage within a community, and then whether or not you want to work with the community or bring individual services, like the solar panels on individual
Yeah, very good question. I think one of the one of the main mistakes made in international development is the community is often viewed as this monolithic, I mean, I use the term because they go fast, but as this monolithic thing, right? The community. People will tell you they went in and talked to the community. It's like, well, even within small communities, I mean, very often very contentious different groups of stakeholders. You may have the church, you might have the fishing cooperative, you might have the farmers group, you might have the elected leaders, then you have unofficial leaders. So that kind of sort of stakeholder mapping of the community, that's the first piece I was saying about our approach, that community engagement piece. You have to spend a lot of time there. There's no way around that. They can't send you a file, they can't send you their org chart, they can't send you all that kind of stuff that you would love to see. And if they sent it to you, it would come from one person who would send you their view of it. And so that's the community engagement piece where you have to get in there, you have to spend time with different stakeholders. So we organize workshops, we invite different groups, you get a lot of different views about what's going on and who's in charge and what they want. Because there's a lot of talk again about identifying needs, but the needs of who and when. You know, you think about your own needs, right? They change from Friday night to Sunday morning to Wednesday afternoon, and then from summer to fall. Like, so if you get interviewed, your answers will be very different. So when people give you an answer, it's not the end truth, right? It's one data point, and you need a lot of data points to come to any conclusions. So I think that's part of the approach. The second piece I would mention is that almost always now, it's the communities coming to us now. Now that we have critical mass on the ground, communities hear about it, they see the services in other communities, and then they come and ask us, what would it take? Cal Energy Corps, he was a blueEnergy fellow, Mauricio, working on cook stoves. So we want it to be more pull than push at this point. Now, on the question about how do you determine if you're going to engage, you know, the community at large or a larger constituency or individuals, it's really an outcome of that process. You know, we work in some communities where it's really only a community in name. You get in there and you see it's really, really family-based. The family units are very strong and the community is very contentious or just doesn't communicate much. Maybe they don't even have a fishing cooperative. They don't have any organizational structure. So you look at where have they come together to organize for other things in the past. And if they've never done that before, that's a huge red flag where you might want to start with individual services. And we learned that the hard way. Some communities we went in the beginning where we were doing more pushing, put in a community system. You know, you do the training. Okay, well, I need more training. Okay, more training. You do more training. And at some point you say, okay, stop. Let's do an evaluation. And you look and see that it's just not working in that community. So maybe you roll back the community service and go back in with individual family service.
What's your relationship with the government there?
Our relationship with the government is actually very good. They view us as very complementary to what they're doing. In the energy sector, they're primarily focused on grid expansion and renewables at the commercial utility scale. So they're happy that somebody is addressing these issues in that territory.
So they're hands-off with you?
Well, our model is actually to engage them head on. So I think we would have an opportunity being in the area where we are to kind of go around them. And in fact, many people, when we were starting, recommended that, you know, just avoid the government at all costs. But the long-term view is that you need to go through the government. It sometimes makes things very slow and painful, but you need, because those are the institutions that are going to, you know, if you ever pull out or if you ever move on or if anything ever happens, they're the ones who are going to be there. So our view is to engage the government. So we have an office in Managua, in the capital city, and we're constantly meeting with people from the ministries, people from the national education institutions, people from the Ministry of Health to coordinate projects. So our philosophy is engage them directly. So
any financial support?
Very little financial support. I mean, it's a very, very poor country. So when they get money, it comes usually in the form of loans. And most of that financing is going towards the utility scale, grid expansion, and electrification. So they did collaborate. There was a Berkeley student, Christian Casillas, who worked with us and the Ministry of Energy on an energy efficiency retrofit in a community where they donated the lights, for example. But you know, they'll often pay for the boat, maybe some food, but there's not usually a lot of cash coming from the government.
Which segues great into my question, which is where do you get the resources that you operate on?
So about 2/3 of our funding this year will come from grants from institutions. Very often, so American foundations and also, but primarily actually from Europe. primarily from Northern Europe. They have sort of long historic ties to Central America and funding. So the Danish, the Dutch, the French, those are the sources for a lot. Where they set their strategic plan, say we want to work on energy access in indigenous communities, but they don't have an operational arm. So they put out a call for proposals. We bid on those contracts. That makes up about 2/3 of our revenue, and then 1/3 is private donations and tuition from the Global Leadership Program. And our budget this year, we're expecting it to be about 1.3 million total.
Do you import the PVs and batteries or stuff, or do you do, is a program to manufacture it?
So we originally were manufacturing the wind turbines in Nicaragua. Most of the other components were, well, we manufacture the water filters as well. Most of the other the electronics components we're buying off the shelf. We actually buy them through a good vendor relationship we have in Managua. At our scale, it hasn't made sense to look at importing directly. But I think down the road, that will make sense. It's a battle with customs and dealing with all of that. So if you...
So, I mean, you're able to find PVs there? And
Yeah, there's a couple energy equipment providers in Managua, in the capital city, that, especially in the last 5 years, the availability of products off the shelf has increased. Now, you're not seeing the price drops at the retail level for solar, for example, in Nicaragua, that you're seeing globally at the wholesale. Everybody's talking about the price less than $1 a watt and all that. You're not seeing that on the ground, but again, it's a question of scale. I think if we were in a maybe in a multi-million-dollar, $5 million budget range, it would start to make sense to import directly and to have our own inventory.
I'm curious about how, when you contextualize it to a culture, you go in and you ask what do you need and how can we make this fit. Does that have effects on the design of the system? Not necessarily where it goes, but how it interacts with the community. Does the community affect the design of it? And does this change for individual systems and for collaborative systems like the school?
Right. You want to take this one?
You're going to have to repeat it.
I guess I'm interested in seeing the relationship between the technology itself and the communities that use it. So very often it's just seeing that technology is not going to change, this community is going to have to adapt to it. But what I like about blueEnergy is that there's a lot of talk about cultural appropriateness and contextualization. Okay, so how does a technology become affected by a community's requirements or culture?
I think that something that I noticed a lot when I was over there was just, in these small knit communities, everybody talks to each other, and so when somebody does get a water filter, for example, or solar panels installed, they're all about it. Obviously, it really benefits them, and then at that point, word of mouth becomes really essential to expanding the project. So yeah, in many cases with the water filters, they would get installed, they would love them, they would tell their friends, and a few times I saw people come and approach like, hey, what can I do to get a water filter installed in my community? Or I built and designed a cook stove, and the family I designed it for, told her friends, and then they came up to me like, hey, how do I get a cook stove? So the benefits are there once you actually install it and put it in. People are all about it, so it gets spread culturally, socially, and yeah.
Right, so I think there's an outward and an inward there. He's talking about the outward, which is you go in and sort of the word of mouth, sort of the ripple effects that way. But also him as a design, as a technical person there working on the design of the cook stove is there, again, it's spending the time with the family. So if they have comments about the design, they can incorporate that. Students play a key role in that. Students that come for the summer who champion one technology and basically listen to feedback and interact with different community members. I mean, they're the vehicle to get the feedback that comes back into the design.
Right. When I designed my cook stove, I surveyed a lot of people and tried to get a measure of wood use and what do they need to benefit them. And in the case of the cook stove, the mother was in the kitchen all day with her children, and the kitchen is all blacked out because of smoke emissions. So that was the most integral part of the design that I try to help with. But yeah, it's all about community feedback and community input, because they're the ones who can be using it, you know, not you. I'm in California now, but
You didn't install in your apartment when you got back?
Not yet, but yeah, it's really important to get people's input and acceptance.
Yeah, and I think what's important too there, just one last point, is that, because a lot of people give lip service to that. We listen to the community, we good to do a half-day survey, but you have to build the institutional capacity to create the space to make that happen for real. And oftentimes, you know, Mauricio's work on the cook stoves, that's part of an ongoing chain. We have more students coming this summer working on the cook stoves. We've been working on the cook stoves since he left. It's a long process. You don't go in and because you're on a 2-week schedule or a 10-week schedule, the family's going to give you all the information you need and the design's going to be perfect at the end of it, right? It's an iterative process over time. And so there's a huge chasm, I think, between what people say or think they want to do and the number of cases where people are actually building the infrastructure and the people and the staff to make it happen over time. It is that community engagement piece that takes time. And a lot of the community members, they're not going to write you a memo, right? They're not going to, if you ask them direct questions in a survey, they might not understand because they don't talk that way. They're not used to hypotheticals in a lot of cases. With a lot of the communities we work with, say, what would you do if you had more income? They're like, well, I don't understand. I don't have more income, so why? So, you know, getting around that and actually getting worthwhile conversation and understanding takes time. And there's no shortcut for that, unfortunately. And it's harder to convince funders to invest in that because it's less tangible. So that's the challenge.
Besides lighting, how else are they using the energy from PVs?
They're using it for lighting, for refrigeration. They're using it for, in some cases, fans, television, radio. Television's a big one. People are very isolated, and so the ability to be connected.
Battery or is it microgrid? Or?
It's battery. All the installations we've done so far are battery supported. Yeah, to be able to store it, to use it at night or on cloudy days.
Are you working at all, you mentioned drip irrigation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in terms of the very long term, I don't know if this is part of your purview or not, but in terms of improving the environmental impact of current production technologies. So farming, fishing, you know, especially, I know something about the pollutants that come out of outboard motors and things like that. Is any part of your project in that direction, or are you mostly just concentrating on the pieces you've defined thus far?
So, very good question. So the drip irrigation I was mentioning as a hypothetical next step for that community. Drip irrigation is something we're starting to talk about. It's nothing that's in our portfolio right now. We're primarily going to be looking to do that kind of work in partnership on the productive use of land, the fisheries. Fatkanik is our strongest partner on the coast. They're a great institution. And their purview is agroforestry. We're working with some other organizations that work on the fisheries side. So I think for us, it's more about how do you build a team of organizations that make sure they're tackling all these issues rather than us trying to become experts in agriculture. Fatkanik has 30 years of experience in that region. They're staffed full of highly trained agronomists. And so it makes more sense for us to work with them and say, what are your energy needs? You know? And Wawashan, that center I mentioned where we're looking at the microgrid work, they've started to explore some irrigation of high-value crops because of variability in rainfall. And so it makes sense for us to be there and as sort of being a utility advisor on energy and water issues. They tell us how much water they need for their crops, and they understand the crop side, and we think about the energy and water side. Because the danger in these kind of environments is that you can get trapped into trying to do everything for everybody, and then you don't do anything well. So we're trying to be holistic and multidisciplinary, but not address every issue. Trying to stay in our sweet spot.
Are there any more questions? No? Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all for coming.